It's been about 2 years that I became acquainted with John A. Dillingham. And the reason why I met his acquaintance is because I've been researching the Kansas City Stockyards, the American Royal, and what has taken place over the last 125 to 50 years. And when I had the opportunity to sit down with John A. Dillingham, I realized that this was the connection by which we could connect the dots in Wyandotte County to the Stockyards, because his father, J.B. Dillingham, was probably one of the most influential persons having to do with the Stockyards and the American Royal. And now that the American Royal is going to be in our own backyard, I thought, well, you know what? We need to really dig into this and really find out what happened and what's going to happen in the future. And so, having met John A. Dillingham and sat down with him a number of times, not only in his office, but with his gracious hosting of lunches at the Golden Ox Cafe, I've learned so much from John. And I thought it would be very appropriate that we have him come and share today in our quarterly meeting of the Wyandotte County Historical Society and Museum his knowledge about the Kansas City Stockyards. And that knowledge is not based from books or documents, as I'm finding out, but from his own personal experience. So with that, John, thank you for being with us, and the podium is yours.
Gene, thank you very much. Hopefully this is in the right place if all of you can hear me. It's interesting that I just got a card from relating to Freedom's Frontier, and that's a National Heritage Area, and I was involved with that in the very beginning. It represents 41 different counties, I think in Missouri and Kansas. And ironically, Ike Skelton played a major role in wanting that to happen, to tell the history of this area. And it's going well and strong and growing all the time now, so thanks very much. It's interesting that I've got, maybe as Gene pointed out, 3 topics. I didn't make any notes, so weave between the Stockyards and the American Royal, and then maybe personal relationships as well. I would start out by saying that, as Gene pointed out, my dad was president of the Stockyards, I think for 27 years while I was growing up. And one thing he told me several times, that publicly J.C. Nichols, and all of you will recognize that name, you said, at least when Dad was around, twice publicly, that had it not been for the Stockyards, there never would have been a Country Club Plaza. So I'll start with that remark. And I have, in some of the things I will tell you, I've accumulated, as Gene has pointed out, over the last 60 or 70 years myself, and I keep stumbling into little things that relate. And it's really intriguing how history goes. We talked about Indian relocation a while ago, and a great-great-great-grandfather at Camden Point drove 300 hogs out to Holton, Kansas, where the new Potawatomi Nation was. Well, I got to thinking, there's a Missouri River in between. I can't imagine driving one hog any place, much less 300. No trains, no highways, no trucks. And then I learned a couple years ago there were some Potawatomis that lived in northern Platte County. Well, he was from Camden Point, north of Platte City, heading towards St. Joe. He must have been friends. So I stumble into these crazy things. I should say too that for those of you that maybe weren't quite aware of this, that the Stockyards was in Missouri and Kansas. And I asked Joe Reardon one day recently, why'd you let whomever name that area the West Bottoms? And he looked at me and like, what are you talking about? I said, well, it's your East Bottoms, isn't it, Mayor? True story. And I don't know who came up with that name either, because it was always a central industrial district, and where Amagoni wine is today was the Drover's Telegram. That was a daily agricultural newspaper, just like the Kansas City Star was a daily paper. And this area to your right up here, 200 acres, brick lined, I understand, with the stockyards. Well, how big is 200 acres? How many bricks on an acre? And these are the hard bricks, not the soft ones. And the original stockyards building, before the current livestock exchange building now, the first one was right on the state line. And through the middle of the lobby, for instance, this aisle was a row of bricks or red granite stones or something. And that was the state line in the lobby. And in those days, 1870s and 80s, whatever, you could break the law in Wyandotte County, step over the line, they couldn't arrest you. So I've heard. Anyway, the '03 flood, and it's hard to really grasp this if you haven't been in one, but it wiped out the bottoms, wiped out that building, the depot, and so our livestock exchange building, the one that the Stockyards now and the Golden Ox resides in, was built in 1910, and Union Station, that George is doing such a wonderful job with now, was built in 1914. The depot then, the Kansas Pacific, was right north of my office and the Stockyards. And I'll go now to another leg that no one has ever talked about, or maybe doesn't know, maybe not right, but anyway, here goes. Right after the Civil War, Texas, when the war was over, and Texas, of course, belonged to the southern side of the debate, had millions, I don't know, a lot of cattle. Texas Longhorns or heaven knows what, but a lot of cattle. And I had always heard this, but just in the last couple, well, maybe year, I was curious because the market after the war, when things are trying to get back to, I'll use the word normal, the markets are really in Chicago, New York, and Europe for steaks and roast and whatever. And I never thought much about it. And in the last few years, I was just all of a sudden, well, you know, and here you have all these cattle. Why is your market clear up there? Well, I learned that you could buy an animal down in Texas right after the Civil War for $4, not a pound. An animal, $4. In Chicago, that same animal you could buy for $40. $4, 40. Well, hell, that's 10 times. When I learned that, then I knew what the game was. I'd heard about the game for 40 or 50 years, but never knew why the game. Well, as soon as I heard that, hell, that was simple. Well, right after the war was over, keep in mind, Chicago, New York, and Europe, Texas, these cowboys went across the Mississippi to either get on the river or anyway head north to Chicago. Unfortunately, Mississippi had been occupied by Union forces. And those folks just said, thank you for the cattle. Didn't pay for them. Well, that didn't last very long. And I know I'm missing a bunch of pieces, but I'll give you what I've stumbled into. All of a sudden, they were driving their cattle to Sedalia, Missouri. I guess maybe railroads were going through there, and so that was working fine until the Texas cattle brought tick fever to Sedalia, and I don't know whether it affected just animals or us individuals as well, but apparently in Texas you're immune to it, but up here you weren't. And it got so bad that the Missouri governor put armed horseback guards on the Missouri-Arkansas border to keep them out. Well, again, $4 and $40. It's strange work, but all of a sudden they start going to Kansas. And all the different towns along now I-70, you know, from Junction City and Salina. But Abilene, I guess, was kind of the go-to spot. Later became known as the Chisholm Trail. 1,000-mile long or whatever it was from Texas to Abilene. The Kansas Pacific, which I guess maybe later became part of the Union Pacific, the depot that again got flooded out in '03. The train was heading west at that point, and I guess was able to, protected by, and it probably, you know, paralleling I-70 today, but protected by Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley, and Fort Hayes, and perhaps other forts from the wild Indians of that time. And anyway, I guess whatever was going on, the Texas legislature, Kansas legislature and the governor said, well, it's okay to get them to Abilene and so forth, but get them on a train and get them out of here. Well, get them out of here means head east towards Kansas City. On the west side of the Kemper Arena today, Hy-Vee Arena now, on the other side of the Kaw River, Wyandotte County, were the quarantine yards. And I just always had heard of them, didn't think much about them, but that was the drop-off point for all the cattle coming out of Abilene on the railroad. And there are thousands and thousands, and I don't know how long they would stay in the so-called quarantine yards, but as I would come up with, long enough for nothing to hatch. Those are my words. and then they would drive them across the 2 or 3 or I don't know how many railroad bridges, one of which is now becoming a restaurant. You read about it in the paper. I never saw them used. But once you came out of the quarantine yards, you went across the bridge just to go to slaughter. Very, very simple outcome. And I never saw them in operation, but today one's going to become a restaurant. And one thought that I had a little maybe humor to my remarks. The state line, as you know, was where the Kaw entered the Missouri. And north of that, the state line in Missouri used to go clear to Iowa. And the Platte Purchase then brought 6 counties into the northwestern edge of Missouri. Now the 6th district are part of the 5th and 6th or 4th and 5th. But anyway, the state line was where the Kaw entered the Missouri River. Well, when you drive down there now, on the northwest corner of the Hy-Vee Arena, they're building luxury apartments in Wyandotte County. Well, I just said the state line was that street in front of them. How come there's land there? I don't know, but if you can imagine having that many cattle, and of course the stockyards, and when I say the stockyards, that area there were kept pristine, I use that word very loosely, on a daily basis, and you can imagine what the cattle did more than on a daily basis. And you had scoop shovels, and where would you put the poop? Well, on the east side of the river, because you're not going to walk across the river to put the poop in. And my hunch is, and I haven't read this anyplace, but the river over years gradually moved west as the east side was being filled. That's just my north of the river mentality, but you can sleep on that next time you're down there and see what happened. I told Bill Hall, who was our landlord, who passed away a month or 2 ago now, that if I was much younger, had some spare change, I'd buy that land that he owned, because I said, hell, I'd grow roses. I'd irrigate it first, grow roses or tomatoes or anything, because it's got to be the best soil in the world. And no one knows about it now. Back to the tick. And after, the cattle finally making it to the quarantine yards, and if nothing hatched across, and I've said, as I've gotten older, as J.C. Nichols said, there wouldn't have been a plaza had there not been a stockyards. And I go a little further and say there wouldn't be a Kansas City if there hadn't been a tick. Because when you take a look at the history of the so-called West Bottoms and look at all the buildings from John Deere in 1869, and I should add the Hannibal Bridge. If it wasn't for the tick and the Hannibal Bridge, would there be a Kansas City? You'll have to sleep on that one and hopefully dig into it a little more. The Hannibal Bridge was the first bridge, railroad bridge, across the Missouri River, any place, the Missouri River. And I was also often curious, St. Joe, Wyandotte, Leavenworth, Omaha, wherever. And I learned just recently, back, I guess, during or after the Civil War, St. Joe was 4 times larger than Kansas City. 4 times. Well, why didn't they get the bridge? There were a couple of guys, or I don't know. Anyway, there were ferry boat operators that charged a fee for the use of their boat when you needed to get something from one side of the river to the other. And they didn't want these free bridges for you to take your stuff from one side to the other. So they fought it. Folks in Kansas City said, well, we'll go for it. And we got the Hannibal Bridge. Fate works in really strange ways. And I've been curious, you know, imagine going into the river and I don't know what word I want to use to build the foundations for a bridge strong enough to hold a railroad train in 1869. Civil War just been over 4 years and the Hannibal Bridge opened. So the tick was doing its thing. Fate intervened for us to get the Hannibal Bridge. And today there's Kansas City. On the Wyandotte County portion of it, my wife Nancy and Alan's mom grew up in Wyandotte County, went to KU and I went to MU and we never got over that. Her dad, Jack Deere, teamed up with Ernie Yarnovich, and when you look at the stockyards and all these cattle coming here, and folks who said, well, Armour and Swift, you know, we need to have a packing plant, and of course the packing plants need to have employees, and then the Croatians, for whatever reason, thought America was better than where they were, and Ernie Yarnoviches and others came and they said, well, you know, hell, we're going to establish our own town. Gosh, it's called Kansas City, Kansas, and Wyandotte County. The history, you know, whether it be Argentine or Armourdale or so forth, and I'll digress and say that Armour, Swift, and Burlington had this brilliant idea that we're going to do our own stockyards. Hell, you know, they need more than one here. Well, today that's called North Kansas City. And the primary streets are Burlington, Armour, and Swift. And I grew up driving across the ASB Bridge until it was closed down on the upper level, and even the old Hannibal Bridge as well. For some reason, the folks that had the stockyards, I guess they prevailed because North Kansas City finally said, well, you folks that are living here now and all this and that, I guess we're not going to make it. So it became the city of North Kansas City, you know. And then, of course, years later, land was annexed north of the river, and there's more land north of the river of Kansas City, Missouri than there is south, which nobody knows. And little remnants of the Civil War still exist because all of us north and independents all were on the losing side. On that, a personal story evolves. The American Royal was beginning in 1899, and as basically seen in the big picture, the predominant breeds in at least this area were the Herefords and Shorthorns by far. And the Hereford building was on top of the hill from the stockyards. Dad's closest maybe ally was Senator Harry Darby, who was your senator after Andy Sheppel passed away. And he was Mr. Republican, maybe for the state of Kansas, played a major role, I think, in finding, if you will, Bob Dole. And Dad and our family, at least after the Civil War, until maybe more recently, were always Democrats. And yet, Dad and the Senator, I still find little things that I just know that they pulled off. And it was interesting that my great-grandfather, Isaac Thompson, on my mother's side, had been in 4 battles of the Civil War, and for some reason, after the war, around 1880, he goes to Scotland and buys a bull and 2 cows. I've never been able to understand why anybody in their right mind, you know, and he didn't take the Queen Elizabeth or 747 or anything in 1880. And the Herefords and Shorthorns are all over the place. Who in their right mind would go to Scotland to buy a Galloway? Well, he did. He ended up having the largest herd in America. He showed in 25 different states, I learned. That was before trucks and highways. I can't even, and before the Holiday Inns, you know, and before McDonald's. So where did he sleep and where did he eat? Anyway, you can imagine that. But anyway, he also was a county judge, Isaac Thompson, and ran for the legislature in 1880, Missouri legislature. In those days, I find out that it's kind of a community service, kind of an expectation of those folks that owned land and had a farm. However, it was not a career. After you were elected and served your 2 years, you stepped down. Today, God, it's a career. So who knows when that changed, but anyway, after somebody else served after you, you could then run again. Well, for some reason, he did in 1998, 18 years later. I can't even picture anybody in their right mind doing that, but he did. And it was interesting that because he was an old boy, the House elected him as chairman of the House Ag Committee. Well, the Ag Committee had to be maybe the predominant committee in those days, 1890s. And there's some serious legislation that came up requiring the president of the stockyards to go down to Jeff City to testify before the legislature. Well, my great aunt who lived next door, Aunt Roxy, she was the little sister of my grandfather, and so Al and I knew her real well and spent a lot of time there. And she said, you know, my father never went to the stockyards. Well, my dad was president of the stockyards at that time. He was the only one around that I knew about. He had the largest Galloway herd in the country, 10 miles away. He didn't go there. Well, I learned that over 50 years ago. And so that thought hit me a year or so ago. I got to digging into it. And Mr. Morris, who was president of the stockyards then, and I'm talking 1898, came from Boston, went to Harvard, and was a Union colonel. Well, my great-grandfather came out of Kentucky, maybe had an 8th grade education, and was a Confederate colonel. Now I knew why. 35 years later, you know, they didn't shake hands. And so, but Mr. Morris had to testify before the state legislature, before the Ag Committee, of which Mr. Thompson was chairman. The chairman recognizes who speaks or who doesn't speak. Somehow, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Morris must have met in the men's room. That's my take on it. And Mr. Thompson said, I understand you're starting a show at your stockyards, you know, to see which animals are the best, called the American Royal. And the Herefords were the big boys in 1889, 125 years ago now. Shorthorns were next. And Mr. Thompson said, you know, I have the Galloway. You might want to consider them. Well, somehow the Galloway became the third leg of the American Royal in 1901. Apparently, Mr. Morrison testified before the committee. And my grandfather, Isaac's son, whom Alan is named after, Alan Thompson, was president of the American Royal in 1905. Up until that, for the first 6 years, and the Angus came in 1902 or 3, I think, the 4 breeds, they were a for-profit institution. And apparently somebody's animal kicked somebody else, and he was going to get a lawyer and sue, and so my grandfather incorporated the American Royal to make it a not-for-profit organization. And at the same time, 1905, brought the horse show, which was in Kansas City at different places each fall, brought it down at night to create the American Royal Livestock and Horse Show. Livestock show was for business, whose animal's the best, and then the night under gas lights and so forth, the women came, were dressed up, and had a horse show. And my grandfather later ran the horse show from 1920s to early 40s, and then he passed away right after the Second World War. Another thing that I haven't dug into, the Missouri State Fair, again back to Sedalia and the Tick, the Missouri State Fair started in 1901. It had to have started under the House Ag Committee, of which Mr. Thompson was chairman, because his son, after being president of the American Royal in 1905, became president of the Missouri State Fair in 1908. Well, I can understand Kansas City, but the whole state of Missouri had to be because his dad played a role in creating maybe the state fair. And I don't know this, but I just stumbled into what I've told you recently. And so the Royal itself, because of the meeting of those two guys in the men's room or wherever, today our family has had, with Alan's 2 daughters, Allie and Molly, both Molly recently become Botars. Our family has 6 active, continuous generations involved in the American Royal. 6. How many things are the rest of us in that maybe have 2, never 3? It just stumbled on me recently, 6, because the 2 of them who hadn't gotten along, didn't know each other, didn't want to for 35 years, somehow worked out a deal that resulted in our family having 6 active, continuous generations. I just stumbled into that recently. It kind of intrigued me. The Royal itself I showed my first calf in 1955, and later in 1956, I had Angus, and we used to have the American Royal Parade. When I went to Whitworth Military Academy, which is now gone, I was a drum major. Of course, you're supposed to lead the band and hold your head up and prance and all that. The time we did it, I followed a herd of horses in front of me. I'll let you figure out the rest of the story on that. Those are my feelings of the Royal. Every Tuesday was Missouri Day, every Wednesday was Kansas Day, and I think they maybe even had an Oklahoma Day. I can't remember now, but these were special days in which the governor came and other dignitaries on that particular day for the American Royal. And everybody, when I say everybody, a lot of folks wore the lapel deal signifying that this year is the American Royal, and it's that time in the fall, and it was always around the third week in October, because that's usually when the first freeze hits, give or take. I don't know if that was tied together, but anyway, that's always when it was. And the FFA, Future Farmers of America, they were created just 3 or 4 doors down the hall from my office in 1928. And I had hogs my freshman year for FFA, and I was on their advisory board for a number of years here until they moved. I think Jimmy Carter came once because we had him up north when he was president, but he was an old FFA boy down in Alabama, and came here and spoke. I don't know why we lost him. We shouldn't have, but we did. And 4-H played a real role. My cattle were 4-H'ers. I was the past chairman of the Missouri 4-H Foundation as well. And that was always a big, big thing. And it's interesting to see the evolution of all these things. I was even on the early board of the Ag Hall of Fame out here. Senator Darby got that to happen. You know, some people say, well, why is it in Bonner Springs? I said, well, it beats Dallas or Cleveland or someplace else, because all the big boys wanted it. But the senator said it'll be here, and my dad and others were in the final meeting at the old Farmland Industries farmland headquarters above North Kansas City. And the senator said, don't let anybody out until they pick us. Well, apparently it worked out. And we have the nation's Agriculture Hall of Fame literally in walking distance. Texans wanted it, you know, Ohio people wanted it, all the big boys. And I've told the Agribusiness Council when we have our annual luncheon and Dad's Award is presented, I said it hit me as I get older that agriculture, specifically food, all of you that are involved in agriculture, the world is your customer. The whole world. Everybody's got to eat. Maybe we need to eat a little less, but everybody's got to eat. And so, all of you that are in agriculture, the world literally, potentially, is your customer. Well, today we think, you know, food comes from Hy-Vee or McDonald's or what all. And I said, the average farmer, first of all, is not a politician. He's busy working. And he's not a publicly inclined individual because he's hardworking and, you know, takes care of his family and and that's it. And yet he feeds over 300 people on average. And yet those 300 people, according to the news, they all vote where the farmer also votes. They forget that that one provides food for these 300. So I said the ag industry needs to step it up mentally, publicly, and telling folks who they are. If nothing else, on all the commercials, get McDonald's and Hy-Vee and all the big boys to be your sponsors, because they wouldn't be here had you not done your job. And yet, the average farmer, and I'm generalizing, you know, is not interested in promotion. He's interested in keeping the bugs off and getting water to the crops and harvesting the crops. So, my grandfather got into the, well, he'd already been in it, but farming business in Platte County and Holt County. In fact, we're having lunch with those folks on Wednesday. We always try to get together. And we've owned the land, and they've done all the farming for, well, 70, 80, 90 years. I don't know specifically what. And as I've told Alan and others, I don't have a single piece of paper on that 80 or 90 years. Handshake. Think of that today. Lawyers would die. I have no paperwork. And I trust them completely, and hopefully they do in reverse. And, you know, they do all the work, and we own the land, and everything's 50-50. All the income and all the outgo, whatever it is, 50-50. No paperwork. And Dad helped the oldest son, Chris, get into West Point, and he's now a full colonel down in Florida, Cape Canaveral. He can't tell me what he does down there. I said, that's supposed to be rocket stuff. Well, he's colonel down there somehow. And then the two boys, so to speak, that now run the farm, they're handing it off too. The younger brother had all girls. Well, Natalie, I still, when I see her at Christmas time or whenever I see her now, I think she's still in college, but she happens to be in the top 3% of the Army as a girl, as a lieutenant colonel. Well, when I was in Korea playing war games back a few years ago, my colonel was an old devil, and here Natalie's a lieutenant colonel too, and God, she looks like she's still in college. So those two farm families are defending our nation so we can meet today and do things. I think I'll stop, and maybe Gene, you have some questions, or somebody else on anything regarding either the Stockyards or the American Royal. But
first of all, let's give John a hand. Maybe someone has a question that you'd like to ask.
When was the last cow at Stockyards?
when did it close?
Yeah, when was the last cow ran through the Stockyards?
1991. Dad and I had lunch at the Ox. Yeah. He started the Ox 75 years ago, same time as Botars. And
Explain Botars. I think that's...
the bells of the American Royal, and Senator Darby and others started it. And it's really, the great thing about it, among other things, it's alive and well big time. and it involves Johnson County, Jackson County, Clay Platte, you name it. And the girls, Alan's oldest, Allie, who is a nurse and now married herself and all that, you know, and her husband's stationed in Alaska now, he's a West Pointer, but whenever she's home, you know, she pals around with her Botar friends that she met. And they come down to the Royal and get involved in different things. It's an amazing thing. You know, the Royal's 125 years old, and they're 75 years, and really hitting home runs big time.
So they're an auxiliary group of the American Royal.
They're the
They're
They're the young ladies, and you become eligible or nominated, whatever the right word is, when you're maybe just out of college, so early 20s. Oh, these girls are on their own at that point. So it's been interesting to watch. Yes, ma'am.
The wood from the stockyards, I have heard that some of that had been salvaged for projects. Do you know what some of that, where some of that wood went to, or was it all destroyed?
Oh, basically destroyed. Maybe destroyed is not the right word, but gone. It's interesting, our building is filled up today, and I should point out that in these pictures, all of us are if you're part of any building, you have a landlord or somebody, and Dad was the landlord of the stockyards, and various people had their place. The whole place was not yours. If you were commission man, you were maybe assigned that spot, and so that was your outdoor office, if you will. You had an indoor office in the stockyards building, and then your outdoor office was there. One of the interesting things, a guy named Mike Flynn was one of Dad's best friends at the yards. He had Wilson Flynn Commission Company, and Mr. Flynn was President Truman's exec officer in France in World War I. And when you study Mr. Truman, he was assigned or picked to be captain of Battery D, and these are my words, but those are a bunch of wild Catholics in those days. And Truman, a Southern Baptist, was maybe the second or third captain to be assigned to be the boss of Battery D. And Mike Flynn was his exec officer. Mike had the top bunk. Captain Harry had the bottom bunk. They were close. And when Truman had his inaugural parade, Battery D marched at it 30 years later or so. Truman, a Southern Baptist, and a bunch of wild Irish Catholics, so to speak. That's always intrigued me as I've gotten older. Any other questions? I've taken a long time. I hope I've given you, next time you're around that area, maybe some of the thoughts will hit you, like where the river's gone and other various things, and you can just picture yourself if you were here, what would you do?
Speaking of the river, when the Corps of Engineers dredged out the Missouri River, did they make any changes right in this area?
Well, they might have. I'll share one story. And I read this years ago, and I could be totally wrong, so keep that in mind. When Mr. Truman was maybe the Jackson County presiding judge in those days, chief executive officer, and I hope I'm right on this, he came up with the idea of taking the Missouri River as it comes out of Riverside on the north bank and digging out a channel east to hook up because there's a bend where the downtown airport goes. And his dream was to take the river here, take that dirt and put it in the current channel and make that whole area a big airport. He had that idea back in the 20s or whenever he was presiding judge of Jackson County. You never will read that, but I mean, the more you find out about President Truman, you know, just for being an old farm boy, his thinking was way ahead of the game. And somehow, you know, at least some of us are appreciative he was a great president. Well, I think I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You see where I'm learning so much about Kansas City and the Kansas City Stockyards, and our director, Amanda Martin, going to do a presentation. We'd like to have Alan to come up and do it as well.
So, we have a proclamation
Okay.
that we're reading today. So, whereas J.B. Dillingham, March 8, 1910 to August 13, 2007, was a former president of the Kansas City Stockyards, as well as a former president of the Chamber of Commerce for both Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas. And whereas J.B. Dillingham joined the Stockyards in 1937 and served as president of the Stockyards from 1948 until 1975, founding the famed Golden Ox restaurant, which developed the Kansas City strip steak and managed the Livestock Exchange building. He also dealt with the Great Flood of 1951 that destroyed the Stockyards, from which it never fully recovered. And whereas J.B. Dillingham and Frances Thompson, a granddaughter of a founder of the American Royal, were married in 1935 and brought up their son and grandsons to participate in the annual American Royal activities. Stockyards land was the home of the American Royal, and later additional land was sold to the city of Kansas City, Missouri for Kemper Arena, now called the Hy-Vee Arena. And whereas John Allen Dillingham, son of J.B. and Frances Dillingham, was born on January 9, 1939 in Kansas City, Missouri, John continued the family legacy in the West Bottoms and with the American Royal, supporting the work of the American Royal Association, which soon will be located in Wyandotte County, just west of the Legends Commercial District. And whereas 6 generations of the Dillingham family have been involved in the American Royal, now therefore, in the stead of Mayor Tyrone Garner of the Unified Government of Wyandotte County, Kansas City, Kansas, do hereby proclaim Sunday, November 24, 2024, as Dillingham Family Remembrance Day.